Steve, I'm going to start with you, since perhaps you participated in that narrative in 1998, or perhaps not, as a Democratic strategist, and we all remember
I participated.
Some of those. It seems like, in many ways, you look at House Republicans. It was House Democrats back in the day that did it on behalf of the president. So you have some of these handful of House Republicans, the true partisans, the ones that have nothing to fear politically, you know, going after Mueller, going after the FBI, muddying things up. Is it going to work?
Well, so I'd say the playbook is similar, if not exactly the same. That we'll give them that. But the underlying, one of the reasons that the outrage on the left was so severe in that case was you were talking about consensual sex in the Oval Office. Now, it was inappropriate, it was sexual harassment, it was all those things. But it wasn't the Russians coming in and trying to change the outcome of an election. It wasn't obstruction of justice in the White House. It wasn't all the things that we see here that, you know, are criminal, and they're not civil, and they're not private and consensual. So it's a different scale. I think we're investigating serious crimes here, felonies. Bill Clinton tripped over it in his deposition. There's no question, and it was a perjury trap for him. But I just think what we're talking about here, the underlying crime or the underlying accusations, are much, much different.
Ramesh, today we found out more from the text messages, and Ron Johnson's had to walk back things even further. But was the damage already done? You know, 2 days of this illusion of these text messages, and all of a sudden we find out, yeah, it was just a stupid joke, and everybody realizes they overread them, and they went over their skis. But I'm guessing those that were trying to muddy the waters don't care.
I think that we've seen an escalation of charges and countercharges, and that most people who are trying to follow this with some degree of diligence but are not junkies are having a hard time sorting through the claims and the counterclaims. And I think actually in the way that ends up helping the Republicans toward the conclusion, just release as much of this as possible. Release the Republican memo, release the Democratic memo, release the source documents. I do think that they've got a reasonable point here in that the FBI, the Department of Justice, the American government in general has a bias towards overclassification.
Well, look, you're echoing David French today in National Review. I read his piece today where he makes the argument, look, this memo, they sound absurd by saying, release the memo. Oh, by the way, we won't show you the memo. But he's like, don't just release the memo, release the source material that you helped produce that memo, which is the, you know, were FISA subpoenas used essentially based on Steele dossier, things like that. That's what the allegation seems to be, Susan.
Right. So now we're going to be in a situation that is very almost Orwellian, where you have the Democrats saying, in effect, well, the underlying classified material is being misused or distorted, but we can't tell you what that is. Right. And now the Department of Justice is basically making the exact same argument. This would damage potentially national security, but we can't tell you why, but you should send this memo to us. I think the political point here, though, is one that we need to come back to. It is the Bill Clinton playbook, which is muddy the waters, overwhelm. Bill Clinton showed, as a political matter, that lying was an effective public defense for him. It bought him time.
That's right.
And then, you know, when he then perceived that he was in legal jeopardy, he changed his testimony when he went to the grand jury. He lied in Paul Jones' deposition. This was, you know, vividly recalled by all of us 20 years ago, exactly last week. There's no way that Donald Trump and his team have not looked at that playbook and understood very clearly what the jeopardy is.
I would submit to you, though, that Bill Clinton and Donald Trump are completely different in terms of going into a deposition. Who would you rather take in as a client, Bill Clinton or a pathological liar?
You know, we've had every parallel in this case to the Clinton case, except we haven't had Trump get up there and say I did not have treasonous relationships with that country.
Well, actually, no. Actually, no.
None of those exact words.
No, but on the Russians, I have no this in Russia. I have no that in Russia. Oh, by the way, Russia, can you find the emails?
But the other parallel we could have, you know, it is true that this is a more serious underlying accusation, but if you end up with perjury, but you don't actually have a charge of obstruction, you don't have a charge of this kind of corruption and this kind of collusion, it's going to play the same way.
Look, I don't think Mueller is going to be referring obstruction of justice and perjury to Congress. If he's referring stuff to Congress, it's going to be bigger than those two issues. And I do think that what we're discussing here is actually a much smaller part of Mueller's probe than we think.